I've never trusted my luck, but desperation has a way of convincing you that this time will be different. When I answered that job listing, I thought I was trading sleep for money. I didn't realize I was trading safety for survival. By the time I found the place, I hadn't slept in a real bed for nearly a month. My car smelled like stale coffee and regret, and every mirror reminded me how thin desperation can stretch a person. The restaurant sat wedged between two condemned buildings, its windows dark, its sign flickering like it couldn't decide whether to exist. Fine dining, it claimed. At 2 in the afternoon, it looked more like a mistake everyone agreed to ignore. I stood there longer than I should have, weighing hunger against instinct, and hunger won. The moment I stepped inside, the world felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The space was too large for the building I'd just entered, the ceiling rising far higher than physics should allow. The air smelled layered old metal beneath expensive spices, something sharp beneath something sweet. A man in a perfectly pressed suit appeared without sound. He smiled like he'd practiced it in private. "You're early," he said. Even though we'd never met, that should have been my cue to leave. I told him I was looking for work. He didn't ask for a resume, he didn't ask for references. He looked at me the way a person looks at a tool they're deciding whether to use. Then he nodded once, as if a private calculation had resolved in my favor. He gestured for me to follow him deeper into the building, past empty tables set for guests who weren't there yet. The owner was waiting in a quiet office at the back. He offered me a job that paid more per night than I'd ever made in a week. Cash. No paperwork. No questions. I asked what the catch was. He smiled and slid a single page across the desk. "Just rules," he said. "Follow them and you'll be fine." I told myself rules meant safety. I didn't yet understand they meant containment. Silas Ashbury didn't look like the kind of man who should own a restaurant like that. He was ordinary in a way that felt intentional, like a disguise worn so often it became permanent. Gray hair neatly combed, suit slightly outdated, posture relaxed but controlled. Only his eyes gave him away. They were dark, not just brown or black, but empty, like light fell into them and never came back. When he spoke, his voice was calm, practiced, and utterly confident that I would agree with whatever he said next. He explained the pay without blinking, naming a number so high I actually laughed at first. He didn't laugh back. He simply waited. When I realized he was serious, the room felt smaller, like it was leaning in to hear my answer. He slid the paper toward me slowly, flattening it with 2 fingers. "Before you decide," he said, "you need to understand how this place functions." The sheet held 6 rules, handwritten in neat, elegant script, not printed. Written, that detail bothered me more than I expected. I read them once, then again my mouth dry by the time I reached the end. They weren't complicated rules, but they were specific in a way that suggested someone had learned them the hard way, not guidelines. Corrections. I asked him why they were necessary. Silas met my gaze, his eyes like lightless wells, and said, "Because people who didn't follow them aren't employed here anymore." The first rule told me never to speak to a guest unless they spoke to me first. The second warned me never to look at reflections near occupied tables. No mirrors, no polished surfaces, no glass. The third rule forbade eating or drinking anything inside the building, even water, even steam. The fourth chilled me the most: never help a guest who calls me by name. I didn't know how they would know my name, and I didn't ask. The fifth rule banned entering any level below the service floor, no matter the reason. The sixth was underlined twice: leave before 4:04 a.m., no exceptions, no overtime, no finishing up. When I looked up from the paper, Silas was still watching me like he was measuring how long it took fear to settle in. I should have walked away. I know that now. But at the time, all I could think about was sleeping indoors, eating regularly, and not waking up wondering which part of my life had collapsed next. I told myself every job has rules, that rich places have quirks, that I was overthinking it. Silas smiled when I finally nodded. It wasn't a happy smile, it was the smile of someone closing a door behind you. He told me I'd start that night and held out his hand. When I shook it, his skin was colder than it should have been, and for just a moment I had the unsettling feeling that something had recognized me. The uniform was waiting for me when I arrived that night, folded neatly on a chair in the staff room. I don't remember giving my measurements, but when I put it on, it fit perfectly, too perfectly, like it had been made for a version of me that already existed. The fabric was heavier than it looked, warm despite the cool air, and stitched with subtle patterns I couldn't focus on for long without getting a headache. When I stepped out onto the dining floor, the restaurant was still empty, silent except for a low hum I felt more than heard. Then, without doors opening or footsteps approaching, the tables were suddenly occupied. One moment they were bare, the next they weren't, as if reality had skipped ahead without telling me. I learned quickly not to stare. Some guests didn't sit so much as settle, bending chairs beneath them like soft wire. Others cast shadows that lagged behind their movements or wandered off entirely, stretching across walls and ceilings with a mind of their own. One table remained empty except for the slow fogging of the glass beside it, moisture pooling until a shape pressed itself forward from the other side, sliding through like breath on a mirror. I felt my pulse in my throat and remembered the rules. Don't speak, don't look too closely, don't react. The senior staff moved calmly, professionally, as if nothing about this was unusual. Watching them, I realized fear would get me fired, or worse, faster than any mistake. My job was simple. Clear, wipe, replace. I didn't question what was left behind on the plates. Some meals shifted when I lifted them, rearranging themselves like they didn't appreciate being disturbed. Others were unfinished but clearly alive, reacting to my presence with subtle movements that made my hands shake. Drinks were worse. As I carried them, the glasses vibrated faintly, whispering names I pretended not to recognize. Once I was certain I heard my own. I focused on my breathing and kept my eyes trained low, watching shoes, table legs, the patterns in the floor. Working without looking felt impossible at first, but panic sharpened my awareness in other ways. I learned distances by memory, obstacles by sound, presence by pressure in the air. Time behaved strangely. Minutes stretched, then vanished. I glanced at the clock only once and immediately regretted it. The numbers didn't make sense, sliding slightly out of alignment when I tried to focus. A guest leaned closer as I cleared their table, and instinct screamed at me to look up. I didn't. Instead, I stared at the floor and backed away slowly, every nerve buzzing. Somewhere behind me, someone laughed. A sound layered with too many voices. I realized then that the rules weren't about politeness or efficiency. They were about survival. Each task completed without incident felt like defusing a bomb I couldn't see. When the clock finally chimed close to 4, the atmosphere shifted. Yes, thinned without leaving. Shadows snapped back into place, chairs straightened themselves. My body ached with tension I hadn't noticed accumulating. I changed out of the uniform quickly, afraid it might decide to stay on me if I waited too long. As I stepped outside into the cool air, the door closing behind me with a heavy finality, I checked the time again. 4:02 a.m. I had followed the rules. I was still alive. At the time, that felt like success. By my third night, I had started to believe I could survive there. Not understand it. Just endure it. Familiarity dulled the edge of fear, and routine made the impossible feel manageable. That was the night I made my first real mistake. I was clearing a table near the center of the room, my eyes fixed on the floor as always, when a glass slipped from my tray and shattered. The sound was sharp, final, and wrong. Every other noise in the restaurant faded, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I looked up without thinking. Just for a second. Just long enough. The thing across the table didn't have eyes in any way I recognized, but it had a gaze. I felt it lock onto me like a hook driven behind my thoughts. Later, I would hear it referred to as the Auditor. In that moment, all I knew was pressure, intense, invasive, and immediate. My vision fractured. the room tilting sideways as if gravity had shifted its opinion of me. I felt something slide through my mind, not roughly but with clinical precision, like gloved fingers flipping through files. Memories surfaced against my will, childhood fear, private shame, moments I had never spoken aloud. Each one paused on, examined, then marked with an emotion I couldn't name before being filed away again. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I stumbled into the kitchen on instinct alone, gripping the edge of a counter as my legs threatened to fold. The noise returned all at once, clattering dishes, murmured voices, the low hum of the building. But it felt distant, like I was hearing it through water. That was when Mara found me. She looked ordinary in a way that felt like a relief. Dark hair pulled back, tired eyes, a familiar kind of concern on her face. She didn't ask questions. She simply pressed a small glass vial into my shaking hand. The liquid inside glowed faintly cyan, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. "Drink it," she said quietly. "Now." I hesitated. The third rule screaming in my head. No food. No drink. No exceptions. Mura must have seen the conflict on my face because she shook her head. "It's not sustenance," she said. "It's stabilization. It's stabilization." My hands were numb, my thoughts unraveling, and the pressure in my skull was becoming unbearable. I drank. The liquid was cold and sharp, like mint and electricity, and it burned all the way down. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure eased. The room steadied. The invisible fingers withdrew from my mind, leaving behind a deep, echoing sense of having been searched. I slid down to sit on the floor, breathing hard. Mara crouched beside me, her voice low. "You met its attention," she said. "That's why the rule exists." I asked her what it had done to me. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "It keeps records of people, of experiences, of useful things." The implication settled in my chest like lead. I wasn't just a server anymore. I was an entry. A reference. Something noted. When I returned to the floor, I worked with a new understanding. The rules weren't about avoiding trouble. They were about limiting exposure, about reducing how much of you the place could take. As I finished my shift and stepped out before the deadline, my head still aching faintly, I knew something had changed. The restaurant wasn't just dangerous. It was organized, and now something inside it knew me well enough to remember. The request came halfway through my 5th shift. Mara found me polishing an already spotless table and told me, without meeting my eyes, that I was needed elsewhere. Not in the kitchen, not on the floor. At a table. My table. The word guest landed wrong when she said it, like it didn't belong to me anymore. Silas confirmed it himself, adjusting my collar with careful fingers and reminding me that certain rules would not apply for this interaction. He didn't say which ones, he didn't have to. My stomach twisted as I followed him across the room, every step heavier than the last. I could feel a tension tracking me, not just from the Auditor but from the building itself, as if the walls were curious how this would end. The Auditor waited in a section of the restaurant that always felt colder. Its form was more defined than when I'd glimpsed it before, almost suggestive of something human without committing to the shape. It gestured for me to sit, and I realized with a jolt that I was allowed, expected to look at it now. The moment I did, fear bloomed sharp and immediate, not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt it anticipating. The Auditor didn't rush. It spoke softly, asking harmless questions in a voice that seemed to echo just behind my ears. Each pause stretched unbearably long. I understood then that it wasn't feeding on terror itself, but on the space before it, the breath held, the moment before impact, the certainty that something bad was coming, and the helplessness of waiting for it. As it spoke, memories surfaced without warning. Not the ones I chose, but the ones that hurt the most. Being trapped in a dark place as a child, lungs burning, convinced no one was coming. The humiliation of failing when I'd sworn I wouldn't. The fear of sleeping alone in my car, listening for footsteps that might mean trouble. Each memory replayed with brutal clarity, not like a dream but like a record being rewound and examined. The auditor lingered on the sensations, stretching them, savoring the tension just before release. I tried to pull away to ground myself, but there was nowhere to go. I wasn't restrained physically. I didn't need to be. My fear held me in place better than any chains could have. When it was over, the auditor leaned back, satisfied, and I felt hollowed out in a way I couldn't name. Not weaker, changed. Like something essential had been skimmed off the surface of me and set aside for later use. It thanked me. Actually thanked me. I stood on unsteady legs and returned to the kitchen without being told, my body moving on instinct while my mind struggled to catch up. Mara was waiting with another vial, her expression tight with something like sympathy. As I drank, I understood the truth I'd been avoiding. Fear wasn't a reaction here. It was a resource, and I had just proven myself valuable. It happened because I was tired, shaken, and just careless enough to forget where I was. I was carrying a tray stacked too high with dishes that refused to stay still. My focus split between the floor and the pressure headache building behind my eyes. Something brushed my ankle, a limb, a tail, a shape I didn't see, and I stumbled. The tray flew forward, clattering loudly, and I lurched backward through a door I hadn't noticed before. I caught myself on the frame just in time to keep from falling, my heart hammering as I realized where I was standing. A narrow stairwell descended into darkness beneath my feet. The air rising from below was cold and wet, carrying a low vibration that resonated in my bones. I knew the rule: never descend below the surface floor. I also knew that curiosity had already won. I took a single step down and another, moving slowly, silently, as if the dark itself might hear me. The stairwell opened into a space that made no sense. The chamber below was vast, impossibly so, stretching far beyond the dimensions of the restaurant above. Hundreds of symbols glowed along the walls and floor, all in shifting shades of blue, their shapes changing subtly when I tried to focus on them. I realized with growing dread that they were reacting to my thoughts, brightening when fear spiked, dimming when I tried to steady myself. The air pulsed with sound, a deep chanting that rose and fell in perfect time with my heartbeat. I wasn't hearing it so much as participating in it, my body unwillingly sinking to the rhythm. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, slick with something dark and reflective. A person was bound to it. Human. Alive. Their chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths, eyes wide and unfocused, as if they were seeing something far worse than I was. Ropes, or something that pretended to be ropes, wrapped around their limbs, tightening slightly each time the chanting reached its peak. Hooded figures circled the altar, some clearly not shaped like people beneath their robes, their movements precise and rehearsed. Beneath it all, under the stone floor itself, I felt something else. A vast, patient presence aware of me in the same way a predator becomes aware of movement above its den. Listening. Waiting. I must have made a sound. A breath, a gasp, a whimper. I don't know. But the chanting stopped instantly. Every hooded head turned toward the stairwell. The symbols flared blindingly bright, and the presence beneath the floor shifted its attention fully onto me. I felt it then, unmistakably. Recognition. Whatever rules govern this place, I had crossed a line they could not ignore. My muscles locked as footsteps began moving toward the stairs, calm and unhurried. I didn't wait to see who reached me first. I turned and ran, the echo of my own heartbeat chasing me up the steps, knowing with terrible certainty that something down there had seen me and would remember. I didn't finish my shift. The moment I reached the parking lot, I kept running, keys shaking in my hand as I unlocked my car and threw myself inside. I didn't look back. I didn't wait to see if anyone followed. I drove until the restaurant lights vanished from my mirrors and then kept going, past the edge of town, past the places I recognized. past the idea that I could still explain any of this away. By sunrise, I was 2 counties over, and by noon I had crossed a state line. I checked into the first roadside motel that would take cash and didn't ask questions when the clerk avoided eye contact. I told myself I was safe because the building was gone, because I had broken away, because distance had always fixed things before. I slept for 12 hours straight, exhaustion dragging me under before fear could catch up. When I woke, something was wrong. The room felt subtly rearranged, like someone had tried to put everything back where it belonged, but didn't quite understand how humans lived. The chair was angled slightly toward the bed. The curtains were pulled back exactly 3 inches. The chair, my backpack, sat on the desk instead of the floor, zipped neatly closed. I stood very still, my pulse thudding in my ears, and told myself I'd done this before sleeping. Then I noticed the smell, metallic, faintly sweet, unmistakably familiar. At the door, a thin line of dark oil-like residue seeped in from the hallway, stopping just short of my shoes. It didn't move, but I had the overwhelming sense that it could if it wanted to. I didn't touch it. I didn't open the door. I backed away slowly, heart racing, scanning the room for anything else out of place. That's when I saw the paper on the nightstand. It hadn't been there before. I knew that with absolute certainty. The envelope was thick, the paper inside heavy, my name written across the front in elegant handwriting I recognized immediately. My hands shook as I opened it. The message was brief and devastatingly polite. It reminded me that my absence had been noted, that my position remained available, and that misunderstandings could be forgiven if corrected promptly. At the bottom was an address. The restaurant's address, updated, as if it had never stopped existing at all. Miss said it never stopped existing at all. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that, staring at the letter until the words blurred. I finally understood what Silas had meant without ever saying it. I hadn't been hired in the way people usually are. I hadn't been allowed to leave. I had simply wandered off like a piece of equipment removed from its proper place. The rules weren't there to trap me, but they defined the terms of engagement. You don't quit that job. You don't resign. You're released when they decide they're finished with you. And until then, no amount of distance will ever be enough. It returned because the alternative wasn't escape. It was escalation. The building stood where the letter said it would, seamless and familiar, as if it had never been absent at all. That night, the restaurant felt charged, humming with anticipation that made my skin prickle. I wasn't given a uniform. I wasn't given instructions. I was led downstairs without being asked, past doors that now stood open, into the chamber I'd sworn never to enter again. It had changed. The symbols glowed brighter, arranged in complex spirals that rotated slowly like a mechanism counting down. Silas stood at the center, no longer pretending to look human, his voice carrying effortlessly through the space as he announced the beginning of the accounting. That was the word he used. Not ritual, not sacrifice. Accounting. They brought in the offering bound but unharmed, dressed in tailored clothes that still carried the confidence of wealth and power. I recognized him from the news. A man whose decisions had ruined lives without consequence. The crowd around the chamber responded with approval, a low vibration of sound and pressure. As the process began, I realized with mounting horror that nothing was being done to his body. Instead, something was being drawn out, streams of color and texture pulled from his chest and head, condensing into visible wisps that hovered in the air. Fear, regret, guilt, rage. Each emotion separated, refined, and held like inventory. The man screamed silently, eyes wide, as parts of him were measured and removed. I was handed a vessel without explanation. A crystal container warm to the touch. As I held it, the contents inside began to move, responding to me. That was when I understood. The faint ache I'd felt for weeks. The exhaustion that never quite faded. The sense of being lighter and emptier after certain shifts. It hadn't been stress. It had been extraction. Without my knowledge, my fear had been siphoned in small amounts, distilled slowly so I wouldn't notice. The vessel in my hands filled further as I stood there, my anticipatory dread feeding it in real time. No one forced me. No one needed to. The system was efficient. It rewarded participation and normalized complicity. I was part of the supply chain now. When the accounting ended, the man was released, alive and unaware, his memories smoothed over, his punishment complete in ways no court could deliver. The entities dispersed, satisfied, and Silas looked at me with something like approval. That was the worst part. The system worked. It targeted those who deserved consequence, those who had evaded justice in the human world. But it didn't stop there. It consumed everyone involved: servers, witnesses, bystanders, anyone close enough to be useful. As I left the chamber, hollow and shaking, I realized the truth that would haunt me from that moment on. Evil doesn't need innocence to function. It just burns through it along the way. The raid began like a noise that didn't belong in the world. Not an explosion, not shouting, more like a pressure wave that rattled my teeth and made every symbol in the building flare at once. The front doors burst inward, followed by the rear service entrance, and suddenly the dining room was flooded with people in unfamiliar gear, weapons humming with a light that hurt to look at. Their voices cut through the chaos with rehearsed authority, ordering all human staff to the floor and demanding that non-compliant entities disengage. That was when the patrons stopped pretending. Shapes unfolded, stretched, and reconfigured themselves into things that chairs, walls, and sanity were never meant to hold. The room became a collision of impossible bodies and disciplined force, reality buckling where they met. I dropped behind a table as something massive tore through the space where I'd been standing seconds earlier. The air filled with screams, some human, some very much not. I saw shadows detach completely from their owners and strike like living weapons. The task force responded with devices that collapsed light inward, pinning creatures mid-transformation. In the middle of it all, Mara grabbed my arm. Her face flickered, features briefly misaligning like a mask slipping. I saw too much in that instant, angles that didn't belong, depth where there shouldn't have been any. "I'm sorry," she said, and I believe she meant it. Then she was gone, pulled backward into a form I didn't recognize as agents converged on her position. Someone tackled me hard, forcing me flat against the floor. A woman in tactical gear shouted orders into a headset, while another scanned me with a handheld device that whined angrily. "He's tethered," the second agent said. "Partially integrated." The words didn't mean anything to me until the pain hit. They injected something directly into my chest, a burning surge that felt like my insides were being pulled apart, thread by thread. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The world narrowed to heat, pressure, and the sensation of something resisting being torn away. I understood then that I hadn't just worked there. I had been woven into the place, my fear and presence stitched into its function. The building began to collapse inward, not falling so much as folding, walls bending toward an invisible center as containment fields snapped into place. I lay there shaking, breath coming in ragged gasps, while agents dragged me toward the exit. Over the ringing in my ears, I heard Silas roar, not in anger but in loss. The sound carried weight, as if something essential was being taken from him. As we crossed the threshold into the night air, the pressure in my chest eased slightly, but it didn't vanish. One of the agents looked down at me with grim sympathy. "We broke the connection," she said. "Not all of it. Whatever you were to them, some of it stuck." I stared back at the collapsing restaurant, knowing with sick certainty that what had been bound once doesn't always stay severed. They told me the restaurant was gone. I watched it happen, saw the structure fold inward on itself like paper pulled into a fist, leaving behind nothing but an empty lot and scorched pavement. No rubble, no foundation, as if it had never existed at all. The task force debriefed me for days, asking the same questions in different ways, testing me, scanning me, watching for signs of instability. They used careful language when they explained what had happened to me: partial tethering, residual integration, permanent sensitivity. They assured me it would fade with time, that whatever connection remained was passive now. I nodded and pretended that was enough. I tried to live normally after that. I moved into a small apartment far from where the restaurant had been. I took a job at an ordinary place with sticky floors and predictable customers. I relearned the comfort of mundane routines: alarm clocks, grocery lists, conversations that didn't carry hidden meanings. For a while it almost worked. But the changes lingered. I could sense moods too clearly, feel tension in rooms before anyone spoke. Sometimes I noticed things out of the corner of my eye that vanished when I turned to look. At night, I dreamed of long tables and low humming chants, of symbols glowing just beneath the surface of the world. I stopped sleeping with the lights off. 6 months after the raid, I came home to find an envelope slid neatly under my door. No forced entry, no damage, just an envelope, heavy paper, my name written in elegant script I hadn't seen since that first night. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a simple card announcing a reopening, a new address, a date circled in ink. The message was polite, almost warm, expressing how my reliability had been missed and how my presence was requested. Not required, requested. That choice of words frightened me more than any threat could have. I tore the card in half and threw it away, then checked the locks 3 times before sitting on the edge of my bed, trying to convince myself it was over. That was when I noticed the uniform. It hung neatly on the back of my bedroom door, pressed and pristine, exactly as it had been on my first night. I hadn't brought it with me. I was certain of that. The fabric looked heavier than I remembered. Darker somehow, as if it had absorbed something over time. Pinned to the vest was a name tag I'd never worn before. The letters were clean, unmistakable. Asijand. I stood there for a long time staring at it, my chest tight with the same anticipatory fear I'd learned never to waste. I wish I could say I called for help. I wish I could say I destroyed the uniform, that I ran, that I fought harder. The truth is quieter and worse. I folded the uniform and put it away, telling myself I just needed time to think. That night I dreamed of standing in a new dining room, larger and more elaborate than the last, serving guests who smiled like they already knew me. I woke just before dawn with the sense of a schedule settling into place around my life, patient and inevitable. Some agreements don't end when buildings fall. Some rules persist even after you stop following them. And once you've been useful, once you've been logged, tasted, recorded, you're never really off the schedule.